Hi everyone, good morning. Pleasure to be back here with treasures from the Rabbi's Library. You know that I get a lot of interest in the things that I write about and the things that I talk about. And people always say to me, you haven't given us enough information. We'd love to have more information. We'd love to have sight of some of the things that you've seen that made you draw the conclusions that you drew. And we'd like to see all the stuff that you have in your collection. So those of you who know, I wrote a book a couple of years ago. It's called Mavericks, Mystics and False Messiahs. And one of the chapters in the book was a chapter about the Get of Cleves. The Get of Cleves was an incredible story. I've spoken about it a number of times. And if you watch the launch of my book that took place here in Beverly Hills, you'll see that there's a whole section of the launch which was dedicated to the controversy surrounding the Get of Cleves, an extraordinary story about a young couple that got married. The husband disappeared very soon after the marriage took place and then demanded a divorce, and he went off to London, and the girl came back and her parents were extremely angry that she'd got divorced and said that the divorce hadn't taken place in a proper fashion. In any event, I've written an extensive coverage of this particular episode in Jewish history, and you can read it. It's chapter 4 in my book, Mavericks, Mystics and False Messiahs. But as the illustration, we had one illustration that I was allowed by Koren Publishers for each one of the chapters in my book. This was chapter 4, and the illustration for chapter 4 was, if you can see it there, I know that Carly will stick it up on the screen when we do the YouTube, and I would encourage you, if you're watching this, to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can see this and the many other videos that I post to YouTube, so that you can get sight of some of these things when they eventually emerge on YouTube in a more edited and perfect fashion. Zoom is not the perfect medium. We later on we add images, etc., and you'll be able to see these things clearer. Anyway, if you see here, there is an image of a particular polemical pamphlet that was published during the course of the controversy, the argument, the terrible polemic that took place as a result of the Get of Cleves, because there was a very strong push from initially the Beis Din in Mannheim in Germany, and later on it extended to the most important Beis Din in Germany, and that was the Frankfurt Beis Din. And the Frankfurt Beis Din essentially said that the Get of Cleves is not a get, and this couple is still married. But many people criticized it, and I have the original of the pamphlet that I used as an illustration in the book, and I've got it here. It continues in the vein that we began last week, which is the massive file that you saw in the first episode of the second series of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. Here we have, I'm going to take it, you see the whole thing is here, we're not in a museum. This is Pinny Dunner's collection, so I can touch it. There's nothing holding me back. I've got here the original pamphlet that was published by the Frankfurt Beis Din. It's quite an incredible pamphlet. This was a controversy that involved the greatest of all the rabbis at the time, a remarkable selection of rabbis. You had Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, the Noid Yehuda, and Rabbi Aryeh Leib of Metz, who was the Shagas Aryeh. You had Rabbi Yosef Steinhardt of Fürth, who wrote a sefer called Zichron Yosef. You had Rabbi Shlomo Chelma, who wrote the Merkeves HaMishnah, etc. And Rabbi Tevele Hess of Mannheim and his Beis Din, and the Frankfurt Beis Din, that they said in this pamphlet, which I'm not going to read to you in every word, they said that due to the mental instability of the husband, the get that he gave to his wife was invalid. But the get was supervised by a great rabbi, Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz of Cleves, We know his grandson better, because his grandson, whose name was also Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz, wrote the Tiferes Yisrael, which is a Perush HaMishnais. But in any event, he was a reliable and prominent German rabbi. And this pamphlet that I'm holding here was written against Rabbi Lipschitz, and also against a man called Rabbi Aaron Shimon Copenhagen, who helped arrange the divorce. He actually wrote a book. Rabbi Copenhagen wrote a book called The Or HaYosha. And they are both accused here of being Mesis Umeidiach. Well, do you know what Mesis Umeidiach is? It's a terrible accusation. Agitators and inciters. And also that they are kidnappers. Perhaps they kidnapped the poor wife, and they're considered to be gamblers. That's what it says here in this pamphlet. And it also says that a public letter endorsed by the Polish rabbinate validating the Get of Cleves had insulted the authority of the chief rabbi of Frankfurt, and therefore the Polish rabbis are clearly degenerate. Especially, and here he's mentioned by name, Reb Shlomo of Chelm, Zichrono Livracha. And they said about Reb Shlomo of Chelm that he used to go to visit. Can you imagine this? This is a terrible accusation. He used to go to concerts, and he also used to play chess. Isn't that a disgrace? It says that anyone who speaks against the rabbis of Frankfurt and the rabbis of Mannheim, this is a Frankfurt-based and published pamphlet, they will be fined and they will lose all of their community privileges. The pamphlet also informs us that the letter from the Polish rabbis was publicly burnt in the courtyard of the synagogue of Frankfurt. So the reason I'm showing you this today is because I want you to know that the image that you saw in my book, Mavericks, Mystics and False Messiahs, is based on this original. I obtained it at auction 8 years ago. I have many other original pamphlets, material, Kisvei Yad manuscripts relating to this, and of course all the other controversies that I write about and talk about. But I know that many of you have emailed me saying that they want to see some of these pieces, that, you know, I'm so limited in what I can show during these programs, these episodes, but I think this one is very important. It dates to 1768. So a very old Pashkeville indeed. We'll move on to the next piece, number 2 on my list. And I'm happy to thank Carly, because she is so incredible at providing me with all the material that I need when I'm doing these broadcasts. You can't see what's going on here behind the scenes, but I can. And I'm telling you that what she does for me is just incredible. You should thank her as much as I should, because I know that you enjoy watching these programs, and therefore it's extremely important that she performs as efficiently as she does. I have to say something else, that I am in the midst of preparing for publication a book of my articles. It's going to come out. The publication date is January 1st, 2021. It's called Hearts and Minds, and it's dedicated to the memory of my mentor and dear friend, Harav Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha. I gave a hesped for him a few days ago, and you can watch that on my YouTube channel if you're subscribed, or you can find it on my website. And we're dedicating this book to his memory. And if you'd like to order an advance copy, please make sure to send me an email, Rabbi, RABBI, at yinbh.org, and we will put you down. I don't know yet what the price is going to be, but at least let's create a list. And if you're interested in receiving the book, and the book will be published in a couple of months, and we'll make sure that you get an inscribed copy as soon as it is issued, as soon as it's published. Let's look at the second piece. Now, I love this second piece. I'm going to tell you in a minute why. It's not for the reason that you'd probably think. It's called Leman Das. Here it is. Leman Das, it was issued, last week I spoke about Rebellion of Magolis, and Rebellion of Magolis was against the Agudas Harabbonim, the rabbinical organization that federated all the rabbis, all the Orthodox rabbis, foreign-born actually, Orthodox rabbis of the United States and Canada, And this was a poster that was issued, and I wouldn't think that this is particularly unique, although you probably won't find many versions of this or any others like it nowadays. And in fact, I had to rescue it, and I had it repaired. You can see, I'm not sure if you can see, but perhaps on the image that will be posted on YouTube, you'll be able to see that I had it backed, and so that it wouldn't disintegrate completely, but was in very poor condition when I obtained it. It's a declaration by the Agudas Harabbonim reiterating their earlier ban on kosher meat products manufactured by factories that also produce non-kosher meat products. It sounds ridiculous to you, right? Because you'd imagine that any factory that produces non-kosher meat products, that none of their products would be kosher. But that wasn't the case in those days. It was the Wild West. And you know that the United States, the Orthodox community as it was in those days, wasn't as meticulous in its observance of Jewish custom and law as in Europe is in the center of Jewish life. And there were organizations and companies that permitted, as it were, kosher products to be produced in factories that produced non-kosher meat as well. Let's say rusht and salami and any of the other processed meats that we are all familiar with. The declaration includes products manufactured by companies that had joint Jewish and non-Jewish ownership, and even if the kosher products are produced on separate premises. In other words, as long as there is cross-contamination, even in the ownership of the company, that is a problem as far as the Agudas Harabbonim is concerned. And at the head of the signatories is Rabbi Silver, who is the president of the Agudas Harabbonim. Now, the reason I find this declaration is not unique by any stretch of the imagination. There were many such declarations which were issued in those days to protect people who were fussy about eating kosher, to make sure that they would eat kosher. But what's interesting about this, allow me to put on my glasses so that I can read the names of some of those who are signed up to this particular poster, this flyer. So Rabbi Silver is at the head. He was the rabbi in Cincinnati. And we also have here Rabbi Chaim Epstein, who was the rabbi of St. Louis at that time. Very interesting man. And then we have Yehuda Leib Grobart. He was the rabbi in Toronto. We have Shimon Zivitz, who was the chief rabbi of Pittsburgh. Now, all of these names are not names that you are necessarily familiar with. And I have to tell you that there was a sense, I'm not going to read you all the names, but you're going to see it on the image that is going to be posted on the YouTube, that there's dozens, probably 30, 40 names on the list here of rabbis, mainly from New York, but also from all kinds of places across the United States. You have here Avram Nachman Schwartz, who was the chairman of the Vad Harabbonim in Baltimore. And you have here Yehuda Leib Farber, who was the chairman of the board of the Agudas Harabbonim in Holyoke, Massachusetts. So you have here quite a range of rabbis. Now, the problem is that when rabbis moved from the center of Jewish life, from the world of Jewish, the center of where it was to be a Jew in those days, and moved to the United States, the one and the greatest fear that they had is that they would be entirely forgotten and overlooked by history. Because they were rabbis of communities that were more interested in economic benefits of living in America than they were in religious growth. And even if they were talented, and there were many talented rabbis here, I don't want to convey to you the idea that some of the rabbis here were not talented. There were, of course, those who weren't. But there were many talented rabbis here who'd studied in some of the great yeshivas or came from some of the great communities of Europe. And they came here to the United States, and they weren't that successful because their communities were not interested in religious growth. They sent their children to public schools, and their shmiras ha-mitzvahs, their observance of Jewish law, was minimal. And even if it was a bit better, they were quite lax at home compared to what their counterparts were like in Europe. And that being the case, what was going to happen to the rabbis of their communities? This was seen as the far outpost of Jewish life. America wasn't like it is today. one of the great centers of Jewish life. Of course, the two great centers of Jewish life in the 21st century are Eretz Israel, where we have 7 million Jews, and the United States of America. We just saw in a survey that was published that never in the last 1,000 years have there been less Jews in Europe than there are today. Europe is a shrinking community, but at one time it was the center of Jewish life. And when it was the center of Jewish life, those Jews who made their home in the United States were seen as deserters, as being disloyal to the Jewish communities, the mainstream Jewish communities of the Jewish world. And the rabbis of those communities were extremely concerned that their imprint, their footprint, would be entirely diminished and perhaps even obliterated by the fact that they'd made the choice to be rabbis and leaders in Jewish communities outside of their places where they were born, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Russia, etc., in Germany, etc. And in order to ensure that their imprint would not be forgotten and that their memories would be perpetuated, they contributed to a variety of different biographical books and publications that would at least sustain their memory, or so they believed, forevermore. They would have some eternal footprint because their memories would be cherished in the publications that came out. The first of these that came out was published by a man called Benzion Eisenstadt. This is the book. It's called Otzar Hatemunot. Otzar Hatemunot. By the way, Benzion Eisenstadt published a whole range of books with rabbinical information. That means biographies and short biographies of rabbis who lived all over the world. But because he lived in Brownsville, in Brooklyn, he was particularly focused eventually on rabbis in the United States. Otzar Hatemunot, and by the way, I have the copy that was here. It's signed by a great rabbi. His name was Chaim Hirschenson. He was the rabbi of Hoboken and West Union City. Do you know who was born in Hoboken at the time that Chaim Hirschenson was the chief rabbi there? None other than Frank Sinatra. I'm not going to post a picture of him here on my treasures from the rabbi's library, but I will find for the YouTube a picture of Chaim Hirschenson, and we're going to post that. Chaim Hirschenson was a great rabbi. We have here the inscription, if you can see it, and we'll include that image as well. But Otzar Hatemunot is a book that contains photographs and very short snippets of information about rabbis who lived in the 19th century and the 20th century, early 20th century, many of them from the United States, many of them forgotten. You're going to see that in a minute. I'm going to show you a photograph from Rav Kook, that I obtained from the Benzion Eisenstadt collection. I obtained it from a dealer that I've written about called Yossel Goldman, who died a couple of years ago. He was based in Flatbush in Brooklyn. But he had bought a collection of Benzion Eisenstadt's photos. Here you can see these photos. This, for example, here, right here. And Carly, make a note that we're going to make we're going to put an image of this onto the Treasures video. This man that I'm pointing at here with my finger is Ramaz Margolius. Do you know who Ramoshe Zvulun Margolius was? Of course you know, because there's a school called Ramaz on the Upper East Side. He was the rabbi of Kilas Yeshurun, KJ. The shul still exists. The rabbi emeritus of KJ is his grandson. And he is an unusual individual who was the person who converted Ivanka Trump. And should we post a photo of him as well, Carly? What do you think? Of course we should. So we will do that as well. He came here to Beverly Hills a couple of years ago, and we spent a few days together. He was here for the wedding of a member of our community, and we're going to post a photo of him as well. But many photos. Why were these books produced? Because the rabbis wanted to make sure that their memories would not be entirely obliterated by history. And all of these names mentioned here in this Leman Das of rabbis who studied in Volozhin, who studied in Slobodka, who studied in Navardik. This is a piece of history. Leman Das was published in 1934, and yet these rabbis are entirely forgotten. Many of their children, unfortunately, succumbed to assimilation, and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren married out, and they are, completely gone, as it were, from the life of Orthodox Jews here in the United States. But nevertheless, they were willing to sign this declaration, if you can imagine such a thing. Their conviction and their commitment to Jewish life was so strong that they were willing to sign a protest against those who were providing non-kosher meat to customers on the eastern seaboard of the United States. Which brings me to my next, and I have another couple of books here, which one of which I'm going to look at in a moment. But it brings me to my next piece, which I think is extremely important and very, very interesting. So the next piece is called Lemi Hatstoko Lemi Boishes Haponim. Lemi Hatstoko Lemi Boishes Haponim. And we're going to have a scan of this, hopefully, which will be broadcast when we have the YouTube. If you're watching the YouTube, you'll be able to see this now in its full glory. Lemi Hatstoko Lemi Boishes Haponim. An Enklärung von dem Vad Harabbonim from Greater Boston. Boston! What was the year of this? The year that this was published was 1940. You know, the arrival in 1932 of Rabbi Yosef Dov, Rabbi JB Soloveitchik in Boston. And by the way, he was a world-recognized person. He was a rabbi who was from a top-tier rabbinic family, and he was a top-tier rabbinic scholar. The Soloveitchik family was world-renowned. He arrived in Boston, and he was greeted with consternation and jealousy by the other rabbis in Boston, who were in the main considerably older than him, and who had been there for many years. Some of them had been there for 10, 20 years, but they couldn't match his credentials, and nor, of course, could they match his Soloveitchik ancestry and his family renown. In particular, his insistence on high standards for local shechita and supervision for the production of kosher food was met with absolute forceful resistance by the rabbis who made money from kosher supervision concessions and whose livelihoods were affected by Rabbi Soloveitchik's very tough line at that time on this issue. But resistance to Rav Soloveitchik initially was completely ineffective, and it was very disorganized until the appointment of a man who I've spoken about in a previous video. If you recall, I discussed the Ma'ane Le'igris of Rabbi Yom Tov Schwartz, a sefer that was written against Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and one of the people I mentioned in that video was a man called Rabbi Mordechai Savitsky, who was born in 1911. He died in 1991, and he was the Rav of a shul in Boston called the Chevra Shas. He became the Rav of that shul in 1939. This poster here, okay, the one that I'm showing you here, was published in 1940, and he was the instigator. And although he was himself, Rabbi Savitsky, we cannot deny, he was a top-tier Talmudic scholar. He was a great Talmud Chacham. He was less concerned, that's the fact, about the rigid adherence to high standards for kosher supervision. And despite his youth, he wasn't actually as old as Rabbi Soloveitchik. He was quite a few years younger, about a decade younger. And nevertheless, he wanted to revitalize the moribund Vad Harabbonim of Greater Boston. This poster is signed by the so-called Vad Harabbonim of Greater Boston, an organization which federated, as it were, Boston rabbis, and it was comprised almost entirely of the rabbis who were opposed to Rabbi Soloveitchik, to Rabbi Yoshapeh, to Rabbi JB Soloveitchik. And in this poster, the Agudas Harabbonim counterattacks Rabbi Soloveitchik's accusations of poor practice, and it accuses Rabbi Soloveitchik of, among other things, using nefarious tactics to gain control of the kosher meat industry and of financially ruining the rabbis of Boston, and using heavy-handed methods to compel rabbis and shochdom in Boston to fall in line with his demands. They also accuse him of falsely declaring himself as the chief rabbi of Boston. By the way, he never did any such thing. He never said he's the chief rabbi of Boston, although he was certainly considered as, at the time, the most prominent rabbi in Boston because of his greatness in and of himself, and of course because of his family pedigree. But they said that he declared himself the chief rabbi of Boston with the support of a wealthy salami manufacturer whose products were under his supervision, despite the fact that he'd never been appointed to any such position by any of his colleagues or by the local community. The poster attempts to straighten the record, so to speak. I mean, I'm not saying for one moment that this poster is correct, and offers a version of events vis-a-vis the efforts led by Rabbi Soloveitchik to assert control over the kosher meat industry, which shows him up in a very negative light. The Agudas Harabbonim was particularly incensed that they had been accused of having reform rabbis as members of the organization. Now, the reason why this poster is interesting, and it's fascinating, I don't want you to think for a moment this poster isn't fascinating, because there's no other one like it that I have ever seen. People are not aware of Rabbi Soloveitchik's involvement in the rabbinic activities of Boston. They know that he started off Maimonides school. They know that he was a rabbi who lived in Boston and used to give shiurim there. But in terms of rabbinic activities, people don't know much about it. It only took place during the 1930s, until we're going to see in a minute in the early 40s, he joined the faculty of Yeshiva University in a way that precluded rabbinic activities in Boston. But what's interesting about this is that it brings me on to another book, one of these biographical books. It's a fascinating book. It's hard to obtain. Google it, Amazon it, see if you can get it, because it's rare. It's an unusual book. It's Chachmei Yisrael de New England, Chachmei Yisrael of New England. It's a biographical book. I don't want to tell you that it's a comprehensive publication in terms of the information that it contains, but somebody spent a lot of time. The person who put it together was a man called, a Chabad Shliach called Maya S. Abramovitz, and he put it together, and it contains photographs and some biographical information, sometimes obtained from the gravestones of the rabbis who are buried in New England, but the rabbis of New England who are entirely forgotten. That's the amazing part of it, that these are rabbis who came from Eastern Europe, massive Talmidei Chachomim, Bekiim, B'chol HaTorah Kula. They knew Shas Bal Peh. These were people who were great speakers, great communicators, and they came to New England. And there were rabbis in communities across New England, on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and nobody remembers them. There's no recollection of them. They don't exist. They're not part of the lexicon of names that we are familiar with in terms of American Orthodox Jewish history. And yet here they are contained in this book. And it's an extremely important book. If you can get hold of it, I know that people watching this video will now try to get hold of it, but it's an exceptional book, a biographical book, which has been absolutely invaluable to me in being able to chart the biographical history of some of the rabbis that I have come across in my historical research. And on that basis, I want to tell you about some of the rabbis who opposed Rabbi Soloveitchik in this campaign of 1940, which tried to undermine his seniority in terms of his rabbinic leadership in Boston and in the areas surrounding Boston. Well, the first one, of course, is Rabbi Savitsky, and we've spoken about him in the past. Rav Mostofsky, who was essentially a great Talmudic and rabbinic scholar, but ultimately he was a businessman who presided over a kashrus organization that gave dubious kosher status to some of the companies that provided kosher food in the eastern seaboard of the United States, in the northeast of the United States. Mostofsky died in 1991. He has some wonderful children and grandchildren, so I don't want this to be seen as a great criticism of him. However, he was the prime mover in this poster, in this polemical campaign against Rabbi JB Soloveitchik that resulted in Rabbi Soloveitchik leaving the rabbinate of Boston and totally devoting himself to the education of future rabbis in Yeshiva University in New York. But he was supported by a bunch of other rabbis. Here we have them. We have Rabbi Mostofsky. Rabbi Mostofsky was who died in 1977, and he was Rabbi Benzion Mostofsky. He was one of the senior rabbis in Boston, and of course he must have, I don't know which yeshiva he learnt in, but he must have learnt in one of the prominent yeshivas of Europe, but he opposed Rabbi Soloveitchik. Then we have somebody called Rabbi David Meir Rabinowitz. Rabbi David Meir was a rabbi in Boston. He was actually a Chabad Chosid, and he had been in close contact with Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who was the Lubavitcher Rebbe who arrived in the United States in 1940. He passed away in 1950. And when he died, he was bitterly mourned by the community in Boston, but he was one of the prime movers against Rabbi Soloveitchik in this campaign. We have here a man called Rabbi Y.Y. Levine. Rabbi Y.Y. Levine, and he was a very interesting man, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov HaKohen Levine. He was actually the Rosh Bezdin in Boston for many, many years. And he died, Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak HaKohen Levine died in let me just see here, if I can find the date when he died. Not sure, I think he died in the 1960s. He was a very great man. He was an interesting man, but of course he was extremely concerned by the competition that Rabbi Soloveitchik posed to him in Boston, and therefore opposed him when Rabbi Soloveitchik tried to create standards in kashrus. We have here Rabbi Hocham, and Rabbi Hocham was also a wonderful individual, was beloved. He died in 1966, and he was a rabbi in New England. He was a member of the Agudas Harabbonim, and he opposed Rabbi Soloveitchik. We have here Rabbi Roggin, another person who's entirely forgotten. His name actually originally was Rogozhnitsky. He was one of those who had opposed Rabbi Soloveitchik. We have here somebody called Rabbi Chayet, another individual. By the way, all of these photographs I obtained from this book, which is Chachmei Yisrael of New England. So when I do my research, these books are so important, because anybody who puts together information, it doesn't matter if it's perfect or if it's not so perfect. If I have information, I can work with that information. And here we have photographs of these Rabbonim who are forgotten. Here's Rabbi Rabinowitz, a picture of Rabbi Rabinowitz, who was the senior rabbi at that time in Boston, and he was the one who, together with Rabbi Savitsky, opposed Rabbi Soloveitchik, as a result of which Rabbi Soloveitchik, when his father died in 1941, he was appointed to replace his father, Reb Moshe, as the senior Talmud lecturer at Yeshiva University, after which he retired from active rabbinic activities in Boston, and the controversy abated. It should be noted, you must note this, that despite Rabbi Savitsky's acknowledged greatness in learning, at one time, by the way, he was even considered as a candidate to take over as the Rosh Bezdin in the Eder Charedis in Yerushalayim. His kosher supervision was never accepted by people for whom kosher food means more than a symbol that you can find on the food packaging when you're checking it in the grocery store. Let's move on to the next piece. See if we can find it. So the next piece, which is fascinating, you'll see in a minute why. The next piece which we have is about Rav Kook. Now, I told you before that I obtained the some of the photographs that belonged to Eisenstadt. Here is one of them. It's a picture. This is from Eisenstadt's book. You can find it in his book from 1909. The original photograph sent to him by Rav Kook when he was the Rav in Yafo, which I have hanging on my wall here in the office. This was Rav Kook when he was a Rav in Yafo, when he first came to Eretz Yisrael, and when he was fully accepted by all the Gedolim and even the Yishuv Hayoshon in Eretz Yisrael as one of the great rabbis of the Orthodox Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael. Of course, that all changed in 1919, 1920, when he was appointed the secular Jewish endorsed rabbi of Jerusalem, and later on he became the chief rabbi of Palestine, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Palestine. He died in 1935. This was Rav Kook in his much younger years, as he appeared in the early 1900s as the Rav of Yafo from the collection of Benzion Eisenstadt as published in his book Otzar Hatemunot, which I showed you earlier. The reason I'm showing you this is because I have here quite an extraordinary piece. When I say extraordinary, I have to tell you that this piece is probably so rare, I would be surprised if there's a person who's watching this particular video who's ever seen this before, and I'd be extremely surprised if anyone else has a copy of this particular polemic poster. It's called Olam Choshech v'Tzalmavet, Olam Choshech v'Tzalmavet, Hashem Yirachem. It was published by the Tzirei Shloma Emunei Yisrael. Not sure who that is. It doesn't really, these posters often had signatories who were obscured on anonymity. They would give themselves a name, but you didn't really know who they were. It was published in 1933. And it's possibly one of the most vicious attacks ever published against Rav Kook. It uses the vilest language to describe Rav Kook and accuses him of sending his blessings to the Maccabi football club. Can you imagine? In relation to a football match that was being played on Shabbos. The accusation was utterly refuted. I have here a piece here by Baruch Shulman, who was the Rav of Sanhedria. He was one of the main supporters of Rav Kook. He published this, it's called Klape Haranagonim, and he completely refuted the allegation and said that these troublemakers just wanted to undermine Rabbi Kook, and that's the only thing that they wanted to do. But the accusation unfortunately stuck, and it dogged Rav Kook until his death. He only died a couple of years later, and even since his death, it's one of the great accusations against him that he spoke positively about a football match that was going to be played by Jews who therefore, because it was taking place on Shabbos, would be Mechalel Shabbos. Now that's very interesting. Let me just read you some of the wording on this poster. Olam Choshev V'Tzalmavet, Yerushalayim Eira Kodesh, in Jerusalem, the holy city. Niskaim Oisoi Ha'ish Amalek, this man who is like Amalek. Yemach Shemayim, his name be obliterated. V'zichroi, and his memory. Asher yishlach birchosoi lemesibas Maccabim, who sends his blessing to the gathering of the Maccabi Hamumrim, who are heretics. Lechalel Shabbosos, who are going to desecrate the Shabbos b'fahesia in public. V'dorsim beregel gavo, used by the way a play on words, and they are treading with their feet, with feet of arrogance. B'la'ag ubuz es nishmas Yisrael, in the most inappropriate and terrible way, on the soul of Israel. Upoitzim b'chol Shabbos for Shabbos, and on each and every Shabbos they undermine es libois Yisrael, the hearts of Israel. Asher ilu hoyo halolu korim es besoreinu hoyo yoisa noach lonu. If they would tear our flesh, it would be easier for us. Rabbi Kook, a man who endorses and supports, as it were, in this poster, in the version promoted by this poster, he endorses and supports heretics who undermine Jewish law and undermine Jewish life. How is it possible that this man should come forward and send blessings to such an ugly gathering of people? Oy vavoy, how terrible is it, the situation that we have reached in our land. We're going to post an image, of course, of this poster on the video that you're going to see on YouTube. However, I want to tell you that there's something, this is a poster, and it's a rare, I have to tell you, extremely rare. I've never seen another copy of it. I'm not sure that one exists in the Jewish National Library at the Hebrew University in Eretz Israel, in Israel and Jerusalem. However, what's more, somebody once said to me, would you come? I have an incredible collection that I'd like you to look through of a great rabbi who lived in Jerusalem in the 1920s and 30s. I said, no problem, of course, I'll come and have a look at it. He said, maybe you want to buy some pieces. There's some things in there which are quite incredible. Anyway, he shows me a typed manuscript which contains a terrible accusation and terrible critique of Rav Kook. He said, I believe that this is something that this man put together, that he typed, and he decided that it should never be published because it was so critical of Rav Kook that it wouldn't be appropriate to publish such a terrible thing. Little did he know that I owned the poster that resulted from this typescript. Here is the typescript of that original rare poster which I've just described to you, which criticizes Rav Kook for his praise that he gave to the Maccabi football team, in the library, in the archive of one of the great rabbis of Jerusalem of that period. I'm not going to share with you who that rabbi was, but I did obtain this piece, and here I have it. It's not just rare, it's so unique, it's unbelievable. This is the original text of a poster that was probably the most critical poster ever published against Rav Kook, in the library of one of the great rabbis of Jerusalem. His family didn't even know that this had been published as a flyer, as a poster. Can you imagine that? Anyway, I bought it, and here I have it. And I know the truth, that first of all, this man got it completely wrong, that Rav Kook was a very great man, a holy man, somebody who foresaw the great changes that would take place in the decades ahead. Even after he died, he was almost a prophet in his predictions of how Jewish life would unfold over the next several decades. And this man, his legacy is, I guess, forgotten. His anti-Zionist, anti-Rav Kook legacy is forgotten, except in the library among the treasures of Rabbi Penny Dunner's collection. So I think that that's a very unusual piece, and I'm happy to share it with you. How are we doing for time, Carly? 15 minutes left. I've got 10 minutes left. 15 minutes left. Okay, we'll see what we can find. Let's look at the next piece. I think that this is a fascinating piece because it's a historical record and something that's extremely important for us to know about. It's called Leman Ha'emet. Leman Ha'emet, here I'm holding it up for you. It was published by the Baal Beito Shel Maran HaGaon MiBrisk Zichrono Livracha. We talked about Rabbi Rabbi JB Soloveitchik. His uncle was the Brisker of in Yerushalayim. And here is a poster that was published after he died, either 1959 or 1961. It's not dated. Where it was during the course of an Israeli election. And it was a notice, it was a published handbill that was put together by the students of the followers of Rabbi Yitzchok Zev Halevi Soloveitchik, the Brisker of, attacking Rabbi Ahron Kotler, I have here a picture of Rabbi Ahron Kotler, an unusual picture. This is a picture of him on a visit to Eretz Yisrael, and his hand is being held by a man called Rabbi Fischl Gelernte. He was from the Chinuch Hatzmai. Rabbi Ahron Kotler was a very strong supporter of Aguda, of the ultra-religious, the Haredi political organization, the party that participated in Israeli elections. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about Rabbi Ahron Kotler. I'm not going to tell you everything about him, but I'm going to tell you the pertinent information that relates to this particular poster, Leman Das. Rabbi Ahron Kotler was extremely close with the Briskerov and with a man called Rabbi Hocham. That means that puts him on a sort of the extreme edge of the Agudas Yisrael organization. This was not a man who particularly enjoyed cooperating or participating in any activities that involved the Zionist authorities in Eretz Yisrael. He was an anti-Zionist, no question about it. Nevertheless, at some point he recognized the writing on the wall that Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael could not, I'm talking about from Orthodox halacha observant Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael could not continue, could not be perpetuated without some cooperation with the authorities that exist in Eretz Yisrael. And I'm sure in cooperation with the greatest of the rabbis at the time, he decided that he was going to endorse anything that involved the Haredi cooperation with the Zionist authorities, with the Israeli government, as long as it didn't compromise any of the halachic observance that is so central to halachic Jewish life. And therefore, he endorsed voting in the elections, any of the elections, the Israeli elections, for Knesset. Now, he also claimed that the Briskerov had told him that Rabbi of Brisk was an anti-Zionist. Before the creation of the State of Israel, he had urged fighting the Zionist movement to make sure that the State of Israel couldn't be created. However, once the Zionist organization, the World Zionist Organization, evolved into the government of the State of Israel, he quietly acknowledged that that was a state of, matter of fact, and he said that those who wish to vote in elections should do so. And in fact, it's important to do that because you have to make sure that you are properly represented in the government that is controlling the lives that you lead. In any event, this particular poster attacks Rabbi Ahron Kotler for claiming that the late Briskerov had encouraged participation in elections for the Knesset in Eretz Yisrael in order to cast a vote for Agudat Yisrael, the Aguda party, which was the Gimel selection. To this day it remains the Gimel selection on your ballot paper in Eretz Yisrael. And the authors of the poster claim that Rabbi Kotler was, and they call him terrible name, they make fun of him. They say to him, Lemana emes, nisparasim Cruz me'es harav ha'mefulpul Mara Kotler. I have the poster, by the way. I'm not going to show it. Maybe I will. If we can create an image of it, Carly, we should put it up. I have the original post in which Rabbi Ahron Kotler said that you should vote in Israeli elections. And they call him Harav Hagon HaMefulpul. That's making fun of him. HaMefulpul means he is somebody who makes pilpul, who manages to contrive information in a sort of Talmudic sense, even if that information isn't true. That's the word that's being used here to describe the great Rabbi Ahron Kotler. Leishtatif bebechiras liknesses Medina Hatzionis, who has encouraged people to participate in elections for the Israeli Knesset, the Zionist Knesset, Letova Rishimas Gimel, so in favor of the Gimel list of that election. And Harav Hagon Hanal, they said that this rabbi, Soimech Dvarav al Michtav HaYodua, relies on the well-known document, the letter, Shepirsem Lawrence, we're talking about a member of Knesset for the Aguda, Shlomo Lawrence, who had published a letter that he said he'd received from the Brisker Rav. We wish to inform the entire Jewish nation that the Brisker Rav never signed this letter. It's a forgery. I have to tell you that they have no evidence that it's a forgery. I don't believe that Shlomo Lawrence was a liar, and I certainly don't believe that Rav Ahron Kotler would have endorsed a letter that was a forgery and a fraud. Nevertheless, here in this poster, we have people who claim to be, by the way, they don't name themselves, cowards. They don't even name themselves. They say that this letter was a forgery and a fraud, and they say that they hang around in the house of the Rabbi Brisk. Now, interestingly enough, they also mention the Chazon Ish. You should know that Briskers are not big fans of the Chazon Ish or of his followers, and nevertheless they cite him as somebody else who discouraged participation in Israeli elections. What a bunch of nonsense. We all know that the Chazon Ish, who originally arrived in Eretz Yisrael at the invitation of Rav Kook, the first person who he visited in Eretz Yisrael was Rav Kook. He was the advisor for agrarian halacha, of farming halacha, to Pe'alei Agudas Yisrael, to the farming community that was associated with the Agudas Yisrael for the first many years of living in Eretz Yisrael, who was the Gadol Hador, and who certainly was closely associated with the activities of Agudas Yisrael, to even suggest that he discouraged people from voting in elections is complete and utter nonsense. But here you see the power of a polemic. You publish a poster, you hang it up, and you say that that's what somebody said, and there will be people who believe you. That's the power of propaganda. It's the power of misinformation. And that misinformation is not just limited to the secular media, it is also part and parcel of the religious world. We'll leave it here for today, and I look forward to welcome you to my next episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. Always a pleasure to have you on board, and if you would like to watch any previous episodes, make sure to do a search on my website for Treasures of the Rabbi's Library. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click on the icon on the bottom right hand corner of this screen if you're watching this on YouTube. But in the meantime, I wish you Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. We're going to have the month of Kislev. It's a month of liberation from assimilation and from influence from outside forces. Lovely to see you.